To talk about what this all means for the region and beyond, we're joined by Yoichi Shimatsu. He's an independent journalist and a former editor of the Japan Times Weekly. Alexis Dudden is a history professor at the University of Connecticut. She currently is writing a book on Japan's territorial disputes. With us from Beijing is the former Chinese diplomat Xiyu. He's a senior fellow with the China Institute of International Studies. And joining us here in the studio is Katharine Moon. She's a scholar with the Brookings Institution and a professor of political science and Asian studies at Wellesley College. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Katharine, let me start with you.
Sure.
What exactly is this legislation that has provoked so much controversy in Japan and in other parts of the world as well? What does it do to the Japanese military?
The security legislation that the upper house of the Diet will be voting on very soon would absolutely change the political military dynamics within Japan. And the bottom line is this: the Japanese do not have a military that is permitted to conduct military exercises or any kind of offensive measures outside of Japan. So the self-defense forces are literally that. They exist only for the self-defense of Japan. And this is a very unique situation for the Japanese. It is the only sovereign nation in the world that does not have the capacity to wage war outside of its borders. And that is a consequence of the World War II Constitution imposed by the United States as the victor. And the Japanese Constitution posits that the Japanese military will always remain a peace-loving, peace-maintaining, self-defense force, and that the Japanese people relinquish forever the right to wage war.
And just to be clear, what's being proposed here is not a change to the Japanese constitutions, but a reinterpretation of what's already there.
Yes, I think this is very important. Prime Minister Abe, the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, his ruling party, the conservatives in Japan know that the peace constitution is basically sacrosanct in Japanese society. There is no way that the Japanese public will now or in the near future change the terms of the Constitution. However, in order to enable legally the self-defense forces to take more active military roles abroad, Prime Minister Abe is trying to push for this legislation so that a legislative, not constitutional, but legislative transformation can permit the SDF to do what Mr. Abe wants.
Right, let's go to Yoichi. Yoichi, there is opposition to what the Prime Minister is trying to do. There's opposition in Parliament, there's opposition among the Japanese public. So why is he so intent on ramming this through Parliament?
Well, the problem is the opposition in Parliament is heavily outvoted. The opposition is very fragmented, and some of the opposition parties, in fact, do support Shinzo Abe's program. And you have to understand that the ruling coalition of the Liberal Democrats and the Clean Government Party, Komeito, have a majority in both houses. So they can push through legislation without having to deal with the other parties. On the streets, opposition has been growing, including among young people. The apathetic lost generation have been turning out. We saw protests of more than 100,000 people in downtown Tokyo, protests in 600 locations around Japan. So this is a massive outpouring. And I think that reflects probably the majority opinion in Japan, but that's not how Parliament works. All Shinzo Abe needs is 1/3 of the electorate to dominate Parliament, and with that, he can pass any bit of legislation he wants.
Xiyu, how are these developments in Japan being viewed in China? Of course, we shouldn't forget that during World War II, or just after World War II, when this constitution was imposed on Japan, that was a time when, Japan had occupied China.
Yeah, China now is closely watching what happened in Japan. To China, maybe for the other neighboring country of Japan, the new efforts for the legislation on security will turn Japan into a new Japan. The challenge and uncertainty of the security architecture in this region will be what kind of new Japan we will face after we faced the pacifist Japan for 70 years. So the nature of the security legislation to China is, after the legislation, the Japanese self-defense forces will be turned into a national military forces that can conduct combat abroad. So the nature of the self-defense force will be changed into a military force that can implement any kind of military activities abroad. That is a really big changer of the security architecture in this region.
Alexis, you have written that the Japanese Foreign Ministry has published a map of the country that was published last April. And in that map, it shows Japanese borders extended to incorporate disputed islands. So at its basic level, is this about Japanese territorial claims in the region?
The current security bills are not directly related to this, although the example often used this summer in parliamentary debate have invoked the threat of, it's always referred to as a third country. Most of the protesters, most of the opposition, most of Japan's electorate is savvy enough to know that that means China. And so a lot of the charts and graphs have shown a theoretical third-party missile attacking an American ship off of a disputed island. So yes, certainly the territorial friction in the East China Sea is invoked quite a bit to justify the need to bring about these legislative changes. The collective self-defense notion at the heart of what we're discussing is really quite interesting because it's not new to the debate in terms of what Japan's military capability should be, especially vis-a-vis the disputed territories. What is different, however, this time for the first time, pushback has not only been on the streets, but also has taken the form of constitutional legal scholars, former Supreme Court justices, former politicians, members of both parties, former prime ministers. By definition, in fact, a host of conservative centrist voices in Japan have come out to say these larger security issues may be for a separate discussion, but the idea of collective self-defense is upheld as unconstitutional by a majority of authorities on this topic. And that's what the Prime Minister Abe and his supporters are just trashing. And what we have in this is very much clearly a US-backed plan and desire for very expedient means. And yet, in so doing, the United States is failing to understand that the Prime Minister's method of really thrashing due process in Japanese debate is going to come at the cost of widespread Japanese support, not only for these measures, but also an increasing distrust of the United States.
So here we have a situation, Katharine, where the United States is supporting this legislation, but it was the United States in the first place that imposed this constitution on Japan. So what's changed?
Well, I think before we get to what's changed, it's important to remind ourselves that the Japanese push right now, the Prime Minister's push for the security legislation is very much to accommodate U.S. demands that Japan take up more responsibility financially as well as now militarily, manpower, and in terms of its forces, that Japan pick up more responsibility for the security umbrella that the U.S. has extended to Japan for many, many decades. So last spring, in April, the U.S.-Japan defense guidelines were finalized bilaterally by Japan and the United States. And the security legislation is very much a response to that set of guidelines to enable the Japanese military to become more active in case the U.S. and other so-called friendly nations of Japan need or seek Japan's support militarily. So I think that bilateral or international context is important. Also, Prime Minister Abe has offered these other justifications in addition to what Alexis has mentioned, that the security environment that Japan is in has changed significantly from the era of the Cold War period, and that China's rise, especially economically and militarily, and China's willingness and determination to flex its military muscles in the region, as well as the nuclear missile threats of North Korea nearby, and as far away as Libya, Syria, Tunisia, Japanese citizens have been kidnapped and in some cases murdered by, for example, ISIS and other terrorist organizations. So these kinds of events internationally and regionally have provided more firepower for Prime Minister Abe and his cohort to push this kind of a policy change. Now, whether it's truly legitimate, we can debate that, and I'm of the opinion that the security legislation is not the right way to go to address these kinds of environmental changes in the region and internationally.
Okay, let me get Xiyu's response to that. Xiyu, the changes that the Japanese are proposing to Article 9 of the Constitution, will that be seen as a threat in China?
Well, I do believe Japanese new security legislation will make a new Japan, say a very powerful military power of Japan that will input a lot of uncertainties and challenges in the regional security, including security challenges to China, especially based on the current wrong position about history. China is very cautious to see the military rising of Japan. Just like China's way of thinking is, like former British Prime Minister Churchill said, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So based on the wrong historical position, what does it mean military rising Japan for China? So that is a really challenging question strategically to China, maybe as well to the other neighboring country of Asia.